keeping some of these meetings just so that you can refer back to it. Thanks, everyone.
All right, I'm going to pass it over to Beresford to go over today's agenda. Oh, sorry, Beresford, I think you're muted.
I absolutely am. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Beresford Wilson. Currently, I'm the executive director of the statewide multicultural family support organization known as FAVOR. I'm glad to be here and glad to see you all here. Today's agenda and our work group goals and our objectives are as follows. One, finalize onboarding of state agencies to P20 WIN and develop a data integration framework that uses P20 WIN to identify service utilizations, patterns among children with multi-system involvement, and identify opportunities to improve the behavioral health system. Number two, to finalize a children's behavioral health data dashboard and implement a plan that supports ongoing systems improvement and reduction of health disparities. Our cadence for this work group is quarterly, up to 5 meetings. So I think that includes an extra meeting if we need it. 5 is not quarterly, 4 is quarterly. Today's materials will be a PowerPoint presentation. Meeting objectives is to review dashboard plans, provide feedback on P20 WIN project. And with that, I'll turn phase 2 work group update goals to Scott Gall.
Thanks, Beresford.
I'll bring up the PowerPoint too.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, let me get it back.
Cool, great. So I think everyone has these in front of you just as a refresher and maybe like recentering for the meeting. I know Beresford just covered some of this. There's 2 goals that came out of the first phase of this group, and kind of as I understand it, this is the data integration group that's situated within a larger body of work on children's behavioral health that is situated in, I think, many other kind of different overlapping efforts to improve outcomes for children in the behavioral health system. But this is one piece of it that's focused on the use of data and on that text that's in bold here on being able to use data to identify opportunities to improve the behavioral health system and ultimately the outcomes for residents in the state. And so that's, I think, the kind of most important principle. And what we want to do is have this group focus on a couple of ways in which I think based on the first phase of this, group identified we could use data to develop a richer understanding of the experience of individuals and providers as part of the behavioral health system, and be able to use that data to inform system changes and the development of or identifying ways to improve that system. So the 2 ways are the 2 goals here. One, and I think these are maybe in slightly different order in the slides, so I'll go through them in the other order. One is looking at metrics and indicators for children's behavioral health that people could look at on a regular basis and get sort of a holistic view of different aspects of children's behavioral health, different parts of the system through a dashboard. I think we'll go through that in a minute, and some of the metrics there that this group developed and went through in the first phase, but that's one way of getting a picture of behavioral health outcomes and the behavioral health system. The other way is the first bullet point here, which is looking at the interaction between different types of services, providers, different types of systems, and how children particularly interact with those different types of systems, so that we are developing, again, a richer picture of the experience for those individuals by looking at not just one slice of sort of how they're interacting, or one program, how they're interacting with one program or one system, but really seeing the different ways in which they touch different types of services, providers, or different systems. And so those two pieces, looking at a dashboard that gives us sort of like the pulse check, or understanding what's kind of currently happening, and then looking at ways to link data across different efforts to develop a more holistic picture for individuals that are in the behavioral health system. I think those are the two goals, kind of, as I understood it from that this group is focusing on. And again, that's nested in like a bigger set of work on children's behavioral health in general. But I think the belief is that if we can identify some ways to pull data together and use that data effectively, that it will make the work easier for everyone that's working on this, and ultimately improve outcomes for individuals in the behavioral health system. So those are our goals, kind of as I understand it. But if I will kick the next slide, I think, to Jeff. There, sorry, Elise has to remind me. If anyone wants to like check these or make sure that these still make sense, or if make sure that we have some sort of agreement on the goals here. And I think the modification, the bold text, is a modification from the last round of discussion to make sure that we're explicit that the data is being used to identify opportunities to improve the behavioral health system. This is not an effort that's looking at academic research or something to kind of sit on a shelf. It's so that people can use it to make changes to improve the behavioral health system.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, exactly. That revision was intended to reflect the discussion from last time. And before I jump into that dashboard update, were there any further comments around the goals? And please just jump in because I may not see your hand come up. All right, I'll go ahead and move on to the dashboard update. So this is just to really quickly kind of remind everyone where we last left off. So we had in phase 1 identified this framework and multiple indicators to look at system health broadly around children's behavioral health. So we had agreed on these categories around the framework, and especially that we really want to use the dashboard to drive improvements in health equity. And so on the right side are the various aspects of the data that we're hoping to be able to disaggregate to really assess and improve areas of equity in children's behavioral health. So I'm going to quickly stop sharing the PowerPoint and pull up kind of where we're headed next with the dashboard. So we want to kind of think through what are the next steps we need to understand about these indicators to begin to develop an implementation plan for the system dashboard. So we're just starting to pull this together and wanted to kind of share it as kind of a sneak peek for where we're headed, but also get your thoughts on, are we collecting the right information about each indicator? And is there more information that we should be collecting at this point to inform that implementation plan? But our plan is to get some input on that today, and then really completely fill this spreadsheet out and send it to you in advance of the next quarterly meeting, so that you can really dive into it and provide your feedback at that point. But in terms of what we're looking at collecting at this point, for each of the indicators, we know we need to have a definition of what that indicator is within the source that it's collected. Related to the source, we're looking at who is the lead entity, what is the instrument used, the database that it's stored on, what was the collection methodology, frequency of both collection and reporting, the accessibility of the data in terms of who has access to it now. And so, how would we work with that entity to be able to then utilize that data to make it into a dashboard, and ideally a public dashboard. Looking at, how far back is the data available, so that we could do some longitudinal analysis in the dashboard. And then looking at the variables available for each of the indicators and that we would be interested in disaggregating for. So looking at race, ethnicity, sex, gender identity, age, insurance, income, or other indicators of SES, geography, and whether the school district can be included, and then the special population need. So I think one of the things that we're trying to inform by collecting this information is to see, we know we want these indicators. Do we have the right data sources to really effectively report on these that will inform and improve the health of the system? So with that, I'll stop sharing this and just ask if there's any comments or questions at this point before we move on.
Yeah, at least the data sources, is that a combination of self-reporting and gathered information through interviews and what have you?
It's at this point, it's based on what we had heard really during phase 1 of this work group. When the indicators were identified, this group identified kind of what were the best sources of that data in terms of just what's available really, and what's accessible and what has the most information to inform what we're interested in. I do think as we, kind of fill in that grid, there may be indicators where we go back and see, do we need a different source, an additional source? Is this something where, additional data collection is needed? Does that answer your question?
That does answer some of the questions. I suppose as we move forward and we vet and dig deeper into the data sources, we will validate and qualify those sources as to their validity. A lot of times collecting data, there are some nuances that depending on the population that we're getting it from and how involved they are in the definition of what that data means when it reaches them. Data can look different when we analyze it, but when we have the subjects start to analyze and involved in it, then it becomes more vetted and more relatable to the population that we're getting the data from.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point, and definitely want to have families involved at each stage of planning and execution.
It'll be Beresford, to that point, it'll be a bit of a complicated matrix of, since some of those are existing data sources where there's processes in place where they're collecting those data. It would be interesting to know the answers to your questions for each of them. Because we're not proposing that we're going to replicate those processes. We're going to be picking up on the data that's being collected, but having an understanding about what you're effectively asking and suggesting, which is, to what extent are communities affected, actually involved in the data collection and analysis and reporting. I think that would be important for us to know.
Yeah, I think it also is a nice kind of detail to put on a parking lot way down the line as we begin to populate the different data sources and where the data comes from. But I also want to take the moment to just reassure folks that all the data protections for families is in place on all this. So that all the state entities are following good practice and being sure that people aren't, that the data is being shared in a respectful way of kids and families. So I just want to make sure we.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I see Sherry's hand is up. I'd like, if I could just make one more brief comment, because I had another thought related to Beresford's point, but then we'll turn it over to Sherry. Imagine that we've got this dashboard populated from these various data sources. And we have some nice digestible figures and tables that tell us a little bit about where we stand as a state on each of these indicators. And then you have access to a group of family members and community members who can look at that data, who can digest that data together with as part of the team and as fully engaged partners in that process, and help us understand what we're looking at and what it means and what we need to do with it in terms of actions. That's another way that we can get families involved, not at the front end of collecting only, but also as we gather it all together, help us make sense of this from your perspective as a family member, community member, and what this means, what we need to do. Elise, I'll just turn it over to Sherry. I know you're facilitating the meeting, but I know Sherry's got her hand up, so please go ahead.
Hello, nice to see everybody. Nice to be seen. I wanted to comment that I think it's really great we're going to get a copy of the whole spreadsheet. So that'll give us an opportunity to look at it from our perspective, as Beresford mentioned. We represent a population of mostly adopted families. So knowing that that data is being collected with regard to the behavioral health children population we're talking about is critical for us. And I don't know if it's there or not. I apologize. I'm driving to Boston, so I can't look at anything that you put up. But thank you for including us. And I really look forward to getting those spreadsheet. Do you have some knowledge of when that might be distributed?
I'm hoping well in advance of the next meeting, you know, at least like 3 weeks to give people time to review and comment on it.
Okay, so at least a couple months from now, at least.
Yeah, I would say probably another, 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other comments before we move on? Okay, I'll go ahead and pull back up the PowerPoint. Sorry. So we're going to move on to the P20 WIN project, or the efforts to really look at kind of how children are involved across agencies to support the children's behavioral health system, and using data integration to support that. So we just wanted to start it off that conversation by just kind of revisiting what the goal of doing this project is. It's a bit of a demonstration project, partnering with P20 WIN on this. So the goal is to demonstrate that linking data across agencies and systems can result in an improved understanding of the the interconnected relationship of multiple systems in supporting children's behavioral health. So we really want to use the project to show that it really takes multiple agencies to really support children's behavioral health and well-being. Also, that there are potential points of intervention across the system where we can identify and intervene, and how earlier identification and intervention can decrease likelihood for negative outcomes for children across multiple systems. So when we're looking at children involved in multiple systems, were there earlier point, and for children who have later adverse outcomes, were there earlier points where we could have intervened or communicated more effectively across systems to support that child? So after reviewing those goals, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Manisha to go through kind of our current thinking around this project.
Okay, thanks, Elise. Good morning, everyone. My name is Manisha. I'm an economist and policy coordinator at the Office of Policy Management. I have to say, as a researcher, it's been really exciting working with the behavioral health team to kind of think through this, the research design for this project. So as I'm going to walk you through the design we came up with, and then the framework for your review and feedback. So So as Elise mentioned, we're trying to look at how well does Connecticut's behavioral health system perform in connecting system health involved children to needed services. That's kind of the question that we landed on. And by system involved, we mean perhaps they received funding from OEC, perhaps the family was involved in DCF or the homeless system when for the children and their family. But to better understand children, we're actually, as a first step, going to look at teens. So we're going to look at teens that are Medicaid, covered by Medicaid, and they may be receiving currently behavioral health services, and they may also be facing adverse outcomes. So by adverse outcomes, it could be substance use treatment, it could, perhaps they're expelled from school. So we're going to take this group of teens that we can pull from the data, and then we're going to take a look back at their childhood and see where did they touch the system, as we just discussed, and did they also see, did they receive behavioral health services or any services through the state? And so the thought is that based on the findings we find from this analysis, we can start to kind of connect the dots on, how coordinated is the system? Is there ways that we can provide earlier interventions that we can do to have better outcomes for these children? That's the overlay of the project that we're considering. Elise, if you want to move to the next slide. Some of the questions that come up as we consider this framework is, so again, we're looking, the first step was teens that are on Medicaid, but then how do we define adverse outcomes? So some examples that we came up with was, do they have a school-based arrest or maybe an expulsion, substance use treatment, high ED utilization? But that's some of the questions we want to work through with you. And then when we look back historically to when they were children, what are some examples of touching the system or receiving state services? So, maybe they were in an OEC funded program. Again, maybe the family was homeless or touched the DCF program in some ways, the system in some ways. Perhaps they had some exclusionary discipline actions through the school system. Or we may find that they had no system involvement as well. And then again, for these children, we're going to look at what types of services did they receive? Did they receive some behavioral health services? Or perhaps they were part of the home visitation program through OEC. So looking through the data, we are going to try to understand how many children meet all of these various criteria, and then try to, again, connect the dots on how well system coordination is occurring and how it can be improved. So before we jump into the discussion, Elise, if we can move to the next slide, there are some caveats. So currently we're somewhat limited to what data agencies are participating in the P20WIN system and the indicators available through P20WIN. It's limited to children and youth with consistent Medicaid coverage. Again, so if we're looking at a teen and then looking back to their childhood, if there are gaps in their childhood where they weren't covered with Medicaid, then we might not know, did they receive behavioral health services as an example in those gaps? So consistent Medicaid coverage will help us with the validity of this study. And then finally, as a reminder for everybody, there is no data on referrals. We only have the actual utilization that occurred. We'd have to extrapolate based on what we see on utilization, what that maybe indicates regarding referrals. And it's Lisa, move to the next slide. And we mentioned the agencies that are participating in P20WIN. So on the left are all the current agencies. And we marked with a star the agencies that are part of the Children's Behavioral Health Network. And then on the right-hand side are the other agencies that are part of the Children's Behavioral Network that are not yet part of P20WIN, but you'll see that the first three, DMIS, DBH, and CSSD, we are currently in active discussions to bring them on. So it kind of gives you the lay of the land. I know I went quickly, but I'll kick it over to Jeff, and hopefully we can have a robust discussion on the overall framework and some of the criteria that might be useful.
Okay, thank you. So if we need to flip back to that one of those slides, please let us know, because I know there's a lot there. And in fact, if I can remember these questions here, I think maybe we could flip back to that slide just so that people can see it, because outside of those two questions, you may have lots of other questions about this. But generally speaking, what's your reaction to what you see here? Does it reflect essentially what we've been talking about, which is understanding how children who are in the behavioral health system kind of are multi-system involved and how they move through the system. Are there any questions or just reactions or responses to what you're seeing?
I think this is a good starting point, Jeff. I think, you know, when we engage in activities like this, it is good to keep it within certain parameters, but I think it will grow. The populations that we serve the most over here at Favor, and primarily I'm talking about school-based situations, are teens, high school, and elementary school age children. I don't know what happened to the middle school age children, because I think that's where a lot of that's an upstream position or base where we could where we could gather a lot of information, antecedent information and what have you. So, but I think this is good. This is a good foundation.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good point. I think if you're looking at the left part of the screen right now, where we identify the proposed population, the adverse outcomes list actually do, you know, to your point, trend a little bit towards upper middle school and high school age populations. But, I guess in the middle of the slide and to the right side of the slide, we do look a little further upstream to see, in what ways were they involved in other systems, potentially at much earlier ages. So, for example, family DCF involvement, tends to trend, child abuse and neglect cases tend to trend more towards the younger children than school-based arrests, for example, or substance use treatment involvement. And certainly early childhood home visitation, would be an opportunity for us to go further upstream in terms of intervention.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you. This is Tim. I just wanted to also, I thought it might just a couple of seconds on just the context to remind. I see we have about 20 folks on, and I know a number of folks, if not all these folks, were on the first phase of this. And so some of the challenges to kind of get to this point was, what data is in the P20 WIN system and what agencies are reporting, and then of those agencies, what data is in there. So we had to back into kind of this proposal and looking for people's feedback on this. And we arrived at this backwards look. So that's focusing on 16, 18-year-olds. So Beresford, your point is, again, we could also start with middle school and look backwards, but I think this gives us a fuller look back and then see, and just to relate it back to the original overall strategy and goal of the data integration project for children's behavioral health in Connecticut was, if we had a dashboard in front of us that was fully created, that we're actively populating, that we had access to all the different data points from different entities, state entities, could we develop a snapshot that tells us how well we're doing? We then narrowed that down to becoming a customer of the P20 process, P20 WIN project and process. And so that's what we're proposing today. And the outcome of this would be able to hopefully tell us how well does Connecticut's behavioral health system perform in connecting system-involved children to meet their needs. So that's pretty close to what our stated goal was in the overall mission. And this would give us a beginning of a look back on some of the data and to actively use the system in place. So I think that just a little bit of context for folks. And it's great that we have an opportunity here. And Elise, I want to just comment, it's amazing how much more you guys brought this into focus since the last I saw the proposed agenda. So thank you for that too.
Okay, everybody. ask any other questions, like just or reactions to what you're seeing here, or suggestions for us. Julianne, go ahead.
I'm sorry if I'm missing something, but I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. The only information that you guys are going to be able to garner about previous touches to the system and services provided is coming from the database. So providers like myself who are not in the database, all of those touches are going to be invisible to you. Is that right?
Yeah, why don't we, Elise, if we could flip to the screen that shows. So Tim was talking about this early, just a moment ago, but actually not the questions, but that one right there. So yeah, so like Tim was saying, Julianne, like we're limited to working through the P20 WIN system. We're limited to those state agencies and systems that have agreed to input data into the P20 system. So that's the left side of the screen. And so we had to craft the question and the design of this inquiry really around, what data will we know we have access to?
Right.
So if the data system that you're involved with is not part of the P20 WIN or not a participant in P20 WIN, then yeah, we would be kind of blind to those data points. It doesn't necessarily mean we won't learn anything from it, and perhaps it would inspire us as a state system to say, how do we get more data elements into the P20 WIN system so that we can answer more nuanced questions?
And I guess that's why I'm asking the question, because I did understand the slide and I wanted to be able to say, I think there's a whole sector out there. We have many programs that are supported by these state agencies, and I'm sure our services therefore would be in their data. But there are tons of families that come to our programs that don't have oversight from a state agency. And so I think it just begs the question of being able, if we're really trying to look at what Connecticut offers, then I think this is a great starting point, and at least we're going to be able to get data that we do have accessible. But I think it begs the question of how are we going to take it to the next step when we get this under our belts to be able to say that covers this part, but now there's a whole nother population out there.
There is one big exception: Medicaid. So you report into Medicaid, and so that would be captured on the utilization, the claims data on the back end. So that population is probably going to be the most robustly represented population.
That's for programs that we bill for. That's a really good point.
Correct.
Thank you.
And then the second part, though, to acknowledge your point, it's still yes. So like any good data project or any good data is, as you start to look at data, you always ask the question, what else and what more and what are we missing? But I think your point is, I think Beresford makes that too earlier, and that is, so here's the jumping off point, here's the parameters in which our starting point is. So wouldn't it be great if we could point to the right of this right now and see all of them green and all of them uploading lots of data? That would be ultimately, and then from there, then it's still like all the private providers, if that's again, with all proper parameters, respect to people's owning their data and confidentiality, et cetera. So those are the pieces that how this could actually really grow. But I think what's really great about the snapshot of the proposed project is, again, it gives us a starting point to see how well we're doing with at least this group of 16 to 18-year-olds and how many touched the system during the previous number of years.
I thank you. I appreciate that reframing a bit, and it's encouraging, absolutely encouraging. I think this does look like a great jumping off point. So thank you.
If I can also add to that, so not only Medicaid, right? The fact that our population that we're looking at is everybody on Medicaid. At some point in the second or third phase, we can also consider utilizing the all payers claims database. So through that, hopefully we could perhaps build upon this and get to the privately insured as well. So, but down the road.
Right, that would be great.
Okay, great. Elise, could we flip back to the visual that kind of shows the design? Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Hi, this is Kate Eichel. I just was curious what your identifiers were to connect between the databases. Do all those agencies collect Medicaid numbers? Is that how the tracking?
Okay. Good one for Manisha or Scott.
No, I mean, I can start and Scott can complete. So no, they don't, all of them do not collect the Medicaid numbers, but the P21 uses a probability matching as well. So sometimes it's based on first name, last name, date of birth, other demographic identifiers, address, and then there's a probability matching and linking system built up behind it, and an entire analysis that goes along with that. So I don't know, Scott, if you have more to add.
No, that's exactly right. It won't be perfect because there isn't a single identifier across the systems, but you can get pretty close depending on the different systems that are involved. Actually, since I was talking, I just wanted, Julianne's question earlier, I think is a really good one to bring up, like there's always limits, but I just wanted to know from, I didn't think we did in the introductions, Julie, where you're based, and then I think it's also helpful to think like where are there places that you do report or send data to that, you know, would be, whether it's, I think, through Medicaid coverage or whether it's for some regulatory or licensing purpose or whether it's the private pay through the all payer claims database or something. But I think just knowing kind of where you're sitting, like there's definitely limitations in this, and we should be clear about that kind of upfront.
Any other questions?
I'll throw one out. Does anybody have any strong or any objections to what they're seeing? Is there any objections anywhere? All right. So now on this one, does anybody have any suggestions that they think of when they're thinking about this that might help strengthen this?
It must be a perfectly designed process. But no, everything that people have said in all seriousness has been helpful up to this point. And hopefully this is responsive to everything that we've heard from you as a group over the last year and a half or so. Elise, can we go to that last question? Because if the design is looking pretty good to people and it's making sense, and there's also this question of, okay, let's now envision months down the road that we implement this process, we get the data, we analyze it, we learn a bunch of things from it. How do you envision that these data could be used to improve outcomes for kids? Right, because we don't want to just, we've talked about this as a group, we don't want this to be just an interesting intellectual exercise. The whole point of this is to learn something that can turn into actionable recommendations for improving early interventions and improving outcomes for kids and families. So what are your suggestions for getting us to that point down the road? Julianne?
And again, if I'm missing a piece, but I apologize because I haven't been able to make every meeting, but if we're finding that the kids that have the most adverse outcomes are ones that have been touched by a number of systems, which is often the case. We're very rarely the first place someone goes. We usually have, after they failed out, quote unquote, failed out of multiple layers. So could there be a trigger point, when someone hits the third or fourth or whatever number we choose, system and gets touched by that system, that maybe there needs to be some other more active intervention that gets triggered by that contact, that can give them a case manager, that can, assign a more intensive program, can look somewhere else to be able to get additional sources, so there won't be an additional 4 or 5 systems involved afterward, that maybe we can stem that there. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think that's a very good example of how we had envisioned the use of the end product that we're going to come up with would you know, this P20 project would not, this process would not allow us to do what you're suggesting, right? So what you're suggesting is that some sort of early warning system of some kind could be implemented so that if agencies are touching a child or a family, you know, 2 or 3 agencies are both involved, that somehow that would be flagged in some way, and a care coordinator or a community health worker or somebody along those lines could then outreach to that family and get early interventions in place, so that we're not knowing, oh, you were multi-system involved 4 years ago. I sure wish we would have caught that, right? We need to be able to identify those kinds of situations much earlier. So I think what you just described is a very good example of implications and recommendations that could come out of this process.
Yeah, following on what Julianne just shared, finding a way how to, and I don't have a better description than what I'm about to say, finding a way how to swallow the meat and spit out the bones when youth are multi-system involved and they get to the right door or to the right type of service on their 4th or 5th involvement, and considering they may go through more punitive approaches before they get to the right door. I think it's important to be able to identify the bones, the things that work and the things that don't work, and separate those two and enhance those right fit services to one place. So we'll be able to pick up those small nuances that might be influenced by culture, geographic area, or ethnicity, and or race, and or sexual identification. I think this is an opportunity to do a few things, and I don't want to say too much more. I might want to leave some of these ideas to the wrap up at the end. Okay.
Jeff, it's
Yes.
Sherry again. How you doing? For my involvement with groups and legislature and DCF and system changes, we've been looking for data integration for a very long time. And I think we're going to see more come out of it than we can identify now. We're going to have people that come out of the woodwork down the road and present themselves and say, wow, if we had known you had data along those lines. So what we're doing right now serves all of us, but I think there's going to be more down the road. So I think this is great. As Beresford said, however you separated those meat and bones, it sounded good. So I just think down the road, we're going to have people pop up and say, wow, you have data about that? We could really use it for XYZ.
Yeah.
I also think the way this impacts, not to cut you off, Tim, there's a lot of data that contracted providers collect, and it's not always compatible with the data collecting platforms that the state uses. So to get that data and be able to put it next to what we routinely collect as state agencies, I think it's going to be important to find a way to expand what the state requires and receives. I mean, compliance is one thing, but commitment is something that is greater than that. And I think what we have around the table today is a commitment to do better. So that should it should look like an expansion of what we as a state can receive and what our state agencies can receive. And I've always been in the business of not wagging the finger at state agencies, but asking the question, how can we help you do what you do better than the way you do it?
Yeah, Bear said I was going to make a very similar comment, except from a different perspective. You know, one of the things, and it gets to everybody's point so far, and that is, if you improve quality of life, you also tend to save money. And so this notion that we could look back in time and see some significant indicators and make decisions to enhance, expand, or create new service interventions, and to potentially sunset or let expire other ones. So we're more efficient with our expenditures and where we place our resources. And we see improved outcomes for children, you tend to also save a lot of money. And I know for us in the boots on the ground, we are always interested in improving quality, but there are bean counters, and to some extent, the previous governor and under this current governor, the commitment to state government open and transparent data collection is in some regard about saying to taxpayers, this is how your taxpaying money is being spent. And so being able to make good decisions around enhancements or capacity building in certain areas. That I love, Julian, your comment earlier is like, can we have an army of care coordinators who are ready to get involved in the earliest moments that the indicator tells us if we don't get involved, and we add 8, 9, 10 years to this child, that the chances of multi-system involvement and negative mental health outcomes wouldn't serve us all, particularly the child and the family, to skip that by just inserting a good care coordination process early on to be sure that child's needs are met at that time, and the child doesn't fall between the cracks as the child grows, and to support the family. So and then lastly, I think, and again, I think Sherry, you often raise this, but you represent in some regards on the adoption side, all special populations, right? We're approaching this universal for all kids, but in that data for all kids, you start to see, and there are special populations or who are clearly higher risk than others. And that we then need to be able to identify how to improve support to those special populations who have additional needs. So I just appreciate the conversation.
If I could ask a question of the group. So building on everything that's being said here, I wonder if we also expand this, like once we, like Jeff, you said, if we get to a place where we've done the research, we have the data, I think another step would be looking at housing. So looking at how stably housed was a child. Like, was the address changing often? Was it consistent? I think maybe we could start, Department of Labor is one of our partners. They actually do the matching for us actually in the P21 system. So looking at the parent or parents to see what their employment looks like, and the indications of that, like how that might be also, I think we know the answer in one regard, but just having it presented within the data might be something of interest for the group.
Good point. Yeah. So just it makes me think about making sure that we're not just looking at this from the standpoint of services, but that we're also thinking about this from the standpoint of social determinants of health. And housing being a really good example of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Other thoughts or questions before we turn it over, I think, to Beresford to wrap us up and some final thoughts. Okay, thanks everybody. Either Elise or Beresford, take it away.
Yeah, like I said, I wanted to squelch my comments a little bit because wanted to save something for the wrap up. But I think in those comments, there was a lot of wrap up, not only my comments, but what everyone else said, especially what you just added to that, Manisha. I think about myself and my childhood. And it took me to adulthood to realize that since the time I was born, and that was in the 50s, so I'm aging myself. My family probably moved to various different locations every 2 to 4 years. And I never thought how that might have impacted myself or my younger brother who had some mental health and social developmental issues. That's a very poignant and important point. And I think this is what data does. And I'm not a data person, so you all can identify with this more than I can. But it forces you to ask the questions considering what the last answer was. So data next to data causes you to ask more questions and create more data. And I think it's a good thing that we're doing. And this is an opportunity that the state of Connecticut in this fashion has never taken advantage of before. This is a new area and an opportunity for us to improve. I thank everyone for being here and being committed and not only complying to what we know we need to do, but this speaks loudly towards the desire to get it right and the desire to help families and the little ones come up with better outcomes. So moving forward and what next steps are will be more, of course, more of this and more dialogue like this so we can expand upon the questions and the goals that we have in place. We've picked P20 Win as a platform to use. I'm sure that this work will end up expounding on that also. But this is absolutely the right thing to do. And if Elise, you have anything else to add to the next steps in helping us to understand the opportunities we have to grow and to grow this, please add to it. I like for you because this is your work. You have your hands on the steering wheel, so I like to always give that person the opportunity to have the last word and shine.
Thank you so much, Beresford. I think the only thing I would add is just some specifics that we'll follow up on is that dashboard planning grid to get that to you well in advance of the next meeting. And, of course, some follow up on the project that we're starting to lay out here and the great feedback that we got from you all today. But I would also just, I think to echo some of the comments earlier around expanding some of the availability of data and what we can look at. We did have multiple recommendations that came out of that phase one, and we've kind of prioritized these two pieces, the dashboard and the proposed project with P20 Win. But we do have some other recommendations around like the family level indicators and other pieces. And we will get back to those as well. And I think that those will address some of the additional comments and discussion that came up in this meeting. So those will reemerge as well. But thank you all. I'll pass it back to you, Beresford, to close.
Can I just throw out one comment?
Yes.
Sorry,
Absolutely.
thank you, Beresford and Elise. I just wanted to, I think I noticed a few people that were on this call on a invitation that some of us received about looking at what the state of Oregon has done. And I would just make a reference to that here. And if anybody's interested, I would really strongly encourage them, and at least maybe we can send a link out to them for this, is to jump on their website. But one of the things Oregon did 22 years ago was to just start a unique identifier at birth. And they put into place, full guards, honesty brokers to make sure all data was well protected. And they are now reaping the benefits 22 years later, just starting to use the data that they've mined to start to make potentially big policy decisions. But it has incredible utility for a lot of the activities. And it really just was such an incredible presentation that we had the privilege of being a part of. But it is a public facing website, and they just show the dashboards that they were able to create. And basically they collect only all of this residents of the state, the children who are born in the hospitals in the state. So anybody that's born across the border and all that, they don't catch that. So, but they have now starting to look at some incredible data across the period of time and these cohorts that they can start to create. So I just think that it may be a framework and or vision for Connecticut to consider. We're not there, but it would be great to get stakeholders like those invested in this work to be thinking about that and become knowledgeable about it. And then maybe there's an opportunity to press policy and legislators for that kind of thinking. So just wanted to throw that out there. So back to you, Elise and Beresford.
That sounds great, Tim. And if you can you share that information with Elise so she could get it out to us and we can have a look at that information, and with the expectation that it's not going to take us 22 years to respond to this data that we're collecting here. We'll fast track that. Our next meeting is scheduled for September 28th. 2022. Until then, I would say enjoy this good weather, and keep in mind what we're doing here, and it should inspire us to come back to the table with more ideas on how this can be improved. I often have a visual and mental picture of how all this works together, and it's making my head kind of big. But as we do this collectively, I'm sure that we come up with great ideas and processes to move forward. So Elise, I thank you, and everyone, please have a good and safe holiday weekend. It's the 4th coming up, and enjoy yourselves, please, and be safe.